What up, it's Dane here. After watching this video, you're gonna know how many times to train your muscle group per week. So you might have heard people say train each muscle group once per week, which is the bro split, or train each muscle group 2 to 3 times per week. Now, a lot of people seem to prescribe their training frequency based on the protein synthetic response to training wear. Now, we need to understand that resistance training, as I always say, will stimulate the process of protein synthesis. Now, like I always say again, is that net muscle growth will mean that protein synthesis will exceed protein breakdown. Most research shows that the protein synthesis response will peak about, let's say, 5 to 24 hours after the training session, and that brings about the question is, what is the ideal training frequency? Now, a lot of people say is after the protein synthetic response has now decreased, it has stopped, then hit it again. But is this really true? So the common belief is that untrained individuals should train each muscle about every 3 days, whereas trained individuals, the more advanced people that have been training 5+ years, should be training every single day. Now, here's how they got to the conclusion. Because when you're a trained individual, your mixed muscle protein synthesis, and this is the key word here, and again, as always, I will try to simplify all of this for you, but your mixed muscle protein synthesis rate is going to be a lot higher when you train, and then it will come down a lot quicker. Whereas the untrained individuals, and I'll put a graphic on the screen here now just to make it a lot clearer, is that their mixed muscle protein synthesis will spike a bit later. However, it will elevate a lot later as well, so it will stay for a lot longer in duration. Now, here's the thing. All of the research and a lot of studies includes mixed muscle protein synthesis, like I spoke about before. Now, we don't really care about this too much because it's mixed muscle proteins. Therefore, mitochondria, sarcoplasmic proteins, all of these, they don't actually form muscle growth. Whereas what we really care about and what we should focus on is myofibrillar protein synthesis. And this is the creation to form new muscle proteins to form the muscle fiber. So now that we know about the protein synthesis response, if we assume higher training frequencies, like the same muscle group every single day or 6 days a week, and we need to wait for protein synthesis to come down again before we hit the muscle group again, it might not be optimal unless, of course, you're doing very low volumes, like 1 set to failure. But then again, linking back to that, it probably is not the most valid assumption because there's not actually a lot of research showing that you must wait for the protein synthesis response to come all the way down before you hit it up again. Maybe it's on a way down to baseline and then you hit it again instead of dropping all the way down. So not enough research in that area. Okay, so looking at the myofibrillar protein synthesis response and the data, again, remember this is the creation of new proteins to form a muscle fiber. It's more like the untrained subjects gets a higher magnitude of a response, so it gets a higher spike in simple terms, whereas the more trained you become, the lower the spike you get. However, one thing you have to understand though is that the duration is actually the same, and I'll put a graph here so you can understand. Again, in simple terms, basically the more trained you are, the more accustomed you are to this muscle protein synthesis response. Looking at the data of the myofibrillar protein synthesis response, it seems to stay elevated for quite some time, probably around, let's say, 48 hours when you do moderate to high volumes, so about 3 to 4 sets to failure, and we'll talk about training to failure later. Now, one thing we have to mention as well is that protein synthesis is not the be-all end-all. It's not that when the process slows down, that means you've 100% recovered. There are other factors to consider. So the 3 that I'm going to go into now is muscle damage, strength, and of course, total work. So what is muscle damage? Muscle damage is the tearing of the muscle fibers and membranes. Now, how do we get muscle damage? The 3 primary ways we get it. Number 1 is doing new exercise. Number 2 is when you're doing an exercise, let's say like a deficit deadlift or maybe even split squats, where your muscles are stretched under long lengths with a lot of load. And number 3 is that when you really concentrate on the eccentric, so the downward phase of the movement, that's going to rip a lot of muscle fibers, and therefore all of these factors will also cause a lot of muscle soreness. Now, luckily there's something called repeated bout effect. This is where your muscles will become more resistant to the damage. So say for example you do, let's say, pull-ups. The first time your lats, your back, everything is aching. The next time maybe not so much, and maybe like 4 weeks in, it's not going to ache much at all. Now, one thing I have to mention though is that it doesn't just apply to untrained individuals, it also applies to trained individuals that have been training a long period of time. You will still get muscle damage, especially if you keep changing your routine up and if you train with moderate to higher volumes. So on that note, I also have to mention that depending on exercise, single joint, multi-joint, whether the exercise stretches your muscle at longer lengths, that will also depend on how much muscle damage you're creating. On top of this point, it might take about, let's say, 3 to 4 days or even more to recover from the amount of muscle damage that you have caused. Now, similar to the myofibrillary protein synthesis response after training, there's not much data saying that you have to wait till it goes down, and same goes for muscle damage. You might not have to wait like a whole week where your muscles are fully healed again. You might be able to hit it more frequently. However, on that note, as you probably could, if you know my work, probably could have guessed that a deload will probably need to be in place a lot more often in order to prevent injuries and actually allow better performance in the gym. Looking at maximal force production, so basically strength and obviously the amount of force, the maximum amount of force that you can produce, it probably takes about 3 to 5 days to recover from all of that and again hit it hard again with all the force that you've got. So for that reason, you might want to hit each muscle group 3 to 5 times per week, or maybe just a standardized 2 times per week, like a push-pull leg split, and obviously do that twice per week. Now, again, same as muscle damage, same as the myofibrillary protein synthesis response, is that you can't really make an assumption, and the research is clear that you need to wait, like you have to wait 3 to 5 days to recover. You might not be fully recovered, but you might be able to hit the gym hard, and therefore probably lasting about a few weeks. But then again, same as muscle damage, you might need to have a deload on regular occurrences. So before moving on to training to failure and not training to failure, we really need to consider total work, and it might not be the shiniest and the most interesting word, right? It's important. Listen up. So we have low volumes and moderate to high volumes. We'll classify low volumes 1 to 2 sets and high volumes 3 to 5 sets. As you may have guessed, we can recover from low volumes a lot quicker, maybe 2 to 3 days, high volumes maybe 3 or 4 to 5 days, depending on genetics and other variables, sleep, nutrition, etc. Now that we know that, probably again, same as muscle damage, maximal force production, so strength, we can say that we need to hit each muscle group maybe twice per week, or 1.5 to 2 times per week, or every 3 to 5 days. Same as muscle damage, same as maximal force production, assumptions are being made again. Maybe you don't need to go balls to the wall, maybe you can get away with less recovery. Maybe, let's say, if you're doing high volumes, instead of waiting 4 to 5 days, maybe you wait 3 days. However, as you may have guessed again, deloads will need to be in place more regularly. Otherwise, you're just gonna go snap city probably, or just overtrain. Training to failure or not training to failure. Here it is. So leaving 1 to 2 reps in the tank, a lot of people think it might improve recovery, and in my opinion, it could actually lead to more total work, total volume being done. For example, if you think of doing, let's say, pull-ups, and you go to failure, and then you do the next set, you're probably going to get 4 less reps, obviously depending on your rest times, etc., loads of other variables. But that said, if you don't go to failure, or you never train to failure very often, you might not stimulate the whole spectrum of all the muscle fibers, and therefore you're going to lose out on those gains, man. And again, like I said in my previous videos, a lot of other videos, that in my opinion, metabolic stress, so that muscle pump, it really does lead to more activation of all the muscle fibers, and it doesn't lead to muscle growth itself directly. Rather, in my personal opinion, I think it's a byproduct of mechanical tension. So looking at studies between training frequency and its effects on muscle size, there's honestly really no significant difference between training frequency when the volume is matched. Now, one thing we have to consider in a lot of these studies that, trust me, not a lot of people do on YouTube or on the internet, is that there are different study designs. Some have trained subjects, some have untrained subjects. Some have direct measurements of muscle hypertrophy, so muscle growth. Some have indirect measurements. Some use DEXA, so that would be more indirect. Some use more MRI, ultrasound, more accurate methods. Alright, let's sum this whole video up. higher frequency training might not actually be better than lower frequency training, obviously depending on the individual. For some people, it might actually be worse off for them. Number 2, manipulating volume is way more important than training frequency. And in fact, the training frequency, the variance, the differences is not actually that big, again, when total volume is matched. Now, one thing I have to say though is that when you increase your training frequency, it's a good, easy way to increase the total amount of weekly sets you do per week. And the last point is bro splits. Now, in a lot of my videos, I have been saying that bro splits might not be the most beneficial thing for muscle growth, the most optimal. However, from this research that I've done, from the latest knowledge that I have now got, is that as long as total volume is matched, the bro split is no worse off and no more beneficial than a regular split. However, one thing I will say, and one thing I do speculate, and my kind of hypothesis, even though I'm not a scientist, but I guess that's what we call it, is that doing a bro split, let's say for example chest day, back there, you know, that kind of split, is that it might not be the most effective for motor learning and the most efficient, because if you're only bench pressing once a week, squatting once a week, or deadlifting, let's say once per week, especially if you're an untrained individual, so a beginner, which a lot of people that are watching this channel are kind of beginners to intermediate, you might still want to do those compound exercises more than once per week. And in that circumstance, I probably don't recommend you do, let's say, chest day if you really want to learn the compound exercises, for example. So that's just something to consider as well. But again, let's consider some limitations. Again, the video wouldn't be complete without this and all of this research. The two biggest limitations right here is that, number one, a lot of this research, a lot of these studies that I've got, that I looked at, is that a lot of it applies to people that are training to failure and very, very close to failure, right? So if you're not someone that always takes your sets to failure, then a lot of this information might not apply to you 100%, probably still does a lot, but you get what I'm saying. The next step is that your rep ranges. If you're working in a rep range, let's say less than 6, so more of that powerlifting, quote unquote, strength rep ranges, then maybe all of this also doesn't apply to you. Again, most of it probably will. You can use it as a rough guideline, and therefore probably other training frequencies will suit you better. And that links me back to what I said about the bro split, because if you want to become very strong, especially at certain movements like the squat, bench and deadlift, it probably won't be optimal for you to do it once per week, especially if you're just a beginner. If you train, it might be more optimal, or it could be optimal because you are lifting such heavy weights that maybe you can only do it once per week because it causes that much homeostatic disruption. On the other side of the coin, if you're a powerlifter, you'd obviously want to do the movements more and more so you can get better and better, even though you're not going to take every single training session hard to failure, because you're just going to overreach and, as other people call it, overtrain, get to that stage a lot faster. So that's enough for me talking, rambling on there at the end, talking probably nonsense. And again, the bro split, people are probably going to ask me about this, is that, do you recommend it, do you not? In some cases, yes, but here's the pinnacle of this whole video. Don't worry too much about the training frequency. Choose a training frequency that suits your preferences and that suits your schedule, something that you can consistently stick to. And I know it's not fancy, it's not icing on the cake, it's nothing special, but let's face it, the little things every single day that we do gets us to our goal. So really focus on that and focus on the total volume you do per week. That's enough said. One thing I want you guys to do, and one thing I have to mention, is that I got a lot of this information from James Krieger from Weightology, and I'll put the link in the description. So if you like what you heard and you maybe want to check his workout, check it out. A lot of this information, probably all of it, is based in this one video. However, my job, and I did, is just to make it as simple as possible. I know for some people this is not going to be very simple, and for other people it's going to be very simple, the opposite side. But again, click the link in the description to check his workout. It's real good. And that said, Facebook group is now up. Apply for it right now. Getting Jacked with Science. I don't even know how long this video is going to be, but in my opinion it's a good video. So that's it. I'm a bit arrogant, don't I? Scroll down right now, click on the subscribe button if you like to get jacked with science. If you don't, scroll down, click unsubscribe, because we're not going to be a match for each other. you're not gonna swipe left on me, you know what I mean? So that's it. Stay positive, stay smiling, let's get it, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.